back at City and State TV. I'm Gerson Borrero. And this trip to Cuba, this cultural event, educational event that has now been, I think it's the fifth year that you're actually, is it the fifth year, Mickey?
It's the fifth year.
Mickey Meléndez is the person responsible. Mickey Meléndez is a Puerto Rican, Cuban, Latino activist. He's an educator. He's a troublemaker. He's taken over buildings in his illustrious career. He's done things that are actually really, really progressive and not just progressive, the label of actual action on the street since you were born, and you've been raising hell ever since for the right causes. The most recent, before we get into the actual trip and this cultural exchange that with your compañera you actually put together, is there with Cynthia, and I just saw the briefing of, you have 41 people going on this particular trip for a week of cultural and educational exchange in Cuba. You will probably be back by the time Governor Cuomo comes back. I'll ask you about that. There was a point, the most recent, most symbolic, and I guess the fact that you've been committed to the fair treatment of Cuba and not just what is read and the spins and the negativity, is what is known as the Cuban Five. Briefly, what happened with the Cuban Five? Because they're now free. These are actually, by many considered, by Cuban patriots who were actually put in prison because they were trying to prevent terrorists from attacking their country. And they were arrested in Miami, accused by the U.S. government, charged with terrorism when they weren't trying to destroy anything here in the United States. It's a weird case. You can go online and check it. But briefly, the Cuban Five, you got into that. You were struggling for how long were you part of that struggle in getting them free and back home?
Probably for about close to 10 years. They were in jail for 15 years. You know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Miami Cubans felt that this was an opportunity to go and destabilize the government in Cuba. And in fact, there were a number of bombings at the hotels in Cuba. And what Cuba then decided to do was to recruit 5 of their top state agents and send them to the United States to infiltrate the paramilitary organizations of the Cubans that were in Miami. They did that. They got the information. They gave the information to Fidel. Fidel called in Gabriel Garcia Marquez and gave him the information.
That is the Colombian Nobel Prize, right?
Laurie, who passed away last year, unfortunately, and who the Havana Film Festival this year is dedicated to. In any case, he came here, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, met with the Clinton administration officials, and basically the United States government used that information to arrest the Cuban Five. And they were never charged with anything, no conspiracy, no sedition. Some of the charges were as failing to register as foreign agents. Similar things that the United States does in at least 82 countries throughout the world. Anyway, they were given 2 life sentences.
In other words, have spies in other countries that are not registered.
Absolutely.
The United States does that, but they couldn't tolerate these 5 identified freely by the Cuban government of information they received.
And that goes back to the connection between the CIA and the Cubans in Miami and the support that the CIA has historically given the Cuban Miami paramilitary or military organizations. So they were given like 2 life sentences. They were given 15 years, 20 years, and things of that nature. 2 of them had come out a couple of years ago, and in December 17th was a great day for the Cuban people when
Of 2014.
Of 2014, when there was a negotiated settlement of releasing the other 3 remaining Cuban Five.
So all 5 have been liberated from U.S. prisons. No charges were ever filed, except that they were put in prison, but just to be held there. Is there anything that the Cuban government wants to do further in terms of that? Is it part, I know that there's been a lot of conversations, I don't know if you're privy or if you can say, if there's part of also the negotiations towards the normalization that were announced by both President Raul Castro and President Barack Obama in December also. So is that part of what's being done? Is that case ever going to really receive justice?
I'm really not sure about those kind of details. I think that, just having them back home, having the ability of Geraldo going and being there for January 6th of this year when his daughter was born may be enough for the Cuban government. I know one of the stumbling blocks in these negotiations, and they just finished this past week, the third session, was the issue around Guantanamo and leaving Guantanamo. So if there's been a stall in the relationships, I know that that's been one of the key stumbling blocks in moving forward with the full normalization, and that's Cuba wanting the United States to leave Guantanamo.
Back to the trip that you've organized for 5 years in a row. You've been going to Cuba for the last, I think, 20 years on your own.
1983 was the first time I went.
The first time that you went to Cuba in 1983. Why does a Latino have but you grew up as a Puerto Rican. Most people, you're Puerto Rican no matter what you say, but you also have
in the street, I was Puerto Rican. At home, I ate black beans.
There you go. So he was Cuban. What can I tell you? The guy is smart, So it winds up that you have this, you are also part of the Young Lords. You believed in Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos. You've been involved in liberation movements throughout the world, really, that you have sympathy with or empathy for, and that you actually get involved with. In the case of Cuba, what is the one thing you do this cultural educational exchange? You put a group of people, academics, we've interviewed some of them here for City and State TV, prior to the visit or the trip, the free trade agreement that Governor Cuomo was trying to do. Your purpose in taking all these people to Cuba, I know it's cultural and educational, but what's the other factor that you can't measure?
It's bridging people to people. This is about ordinary people from the United States, many of them educators, connecting with ordinary people in Cuba, many of them educators over there, and having that conversation and having that dialogue. The Cuban government from the beginning was very clear in making the distinction between the American people and the American government. The American government was their enemy. The American people have been their friends. And, just the liberation of the Cuban Five, just to go back for a minute, it's just symbolic of the wide support that Cuba and the liberation movement of the Cuban Five have gotten in the United States. So they're very clear about that. So part of what we do is try to connect people with people.
Do you sense, is this real progress, or we're seeing a period, what President Obama announced, you're going into Cuba, you haven't been back since that was announced. So do you think you're going to see a sense, is you already feeling from people that you stay in touch with Cuba that there's a different attitude, or say, are they seeing as a new day already, even if those normalizations are still way up? I mean, way beyond what people think. Because I think Andrew Cuomo thinks he's going to piggyback publicity-wise and somehow Cubans are just dying to get yogurt from New York State so they can eat, because I don't think they even know what yogurt is. But having said that, do you think that, are you getting a sense prior to the trip? I know you stay in touch with officials from the Cuban government. Do you think that there's a sense that there's a new day beginning to happen, or are they still very cautious?
They're optimistically cautious. Understanding and having dealt with the United States for these number of years, it's very promising. It's for the first time, as we heard the first secretary say, it's the first time that they're sitting down at the table as equals, and that's always been the problem, because the United States had been wanting to talk to the Cuba, but they always wanted it on their terms. There are no terms here around the table, so that in itself is very historic and very significant. Nothing in Cuba moves very fast, number one. I don't think that anything in Cuba is going to move unless the Cubans direct it and have control over it. I've always told people, get there before Burger King gets there. I think Burger is there. People need to get there before King gets there to really get a sense of Cuba. There's a tremendous infrastructure that needs to be built. There are billions of dollars that the United States has been holding in escrow for all these years that Cuba needs to build that infrastructure.
Billions of dollars from what?
Well, from commerce, interchange, through other countries. It's just money that's been accumulating interest over these years. Part of the negotiations is actually putting a dollar figure to that. How much has Cuba lost in its trade given the embargo over 60 years? So there's all, because of the effect that the embargo has had economically, there's a dollar figure at the end of this that Cuba wants to negotiate also.
I thought they were capitalists and communists, and they didn't care about capitalism.
Well, I think it's a very different world. I think if you look at Vietnam, I don't think that anything is in its absolute. I think that, socialist and communist countries are looking toward mixed markets. So you can have socialism right next to a free market economy, and I think at least Vietnam is a real good model in terms of that, where you have socialism, and in Cuba it's education, free education, medicine, culture, and sports. And culture is available to people. I mean, people pay 50 cents to go to a baseball game. Interestingly enough, there's no liquor being sold in the in baseball.
They don't sell liquor.
They don't not sell liquor at any cultural or sporting event in Cuba.
That's before the liquor companies get there and start buying up the signage. What do you think? You think you'll ever see that in Cuba?
Havana Club is pretty well rooted. There are two beers. Cristal and Boconero is like you get vending machines actually in the street.
Cristal and Boconero. I don't drink. So which is the best beer? If you go to Cuba, we got Jonathan Lenz from City and State going, which beer should he drink?
Well, if you like amber, a darker beer, you should do the Boconero. And if you like a lighter beer, you should do Cristal.
Only on City and State TV we get that tip. Mickey, seriously, we have the situation now that we have the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, Democrat, announcing this trip. He's been in touch with the Cuban government. Supposedly, there's only a delegation of 20 people. He wants specifically and uniquely devote himself to possible trade agreements that can be done between New York State and Cuba. Does he need a reality check, or is it going to be that easy? Or what do you suggest to Governor Cuomo, even though he hasn't asked you anything?
The first thing I need to suggest, being a SUNY graduate student myself, is to just let the money go for SUNY, and just let's stop this education stuff. And it's unfortunate that there's a dollar associated with here, and that's part of this trip. Is seeing education and the way education is handled in Cuba, and it's a national commitment to young people to build an educated next generation. Yeah, he'll get the reality check once he's there. People want to talk to him. It's great that a governor of any state of this country is going there. But I think that the same way people are misinformed about Cuba, many people that are going there to do these trade agreements and to try to build business are very misinformed. And once they go there and come back, that's when the reality is going to hit them. And again, nothing's going to happen in Cuba until the Cubans decide, and it's going to be in Cuba, it'll be under their conditions.
Two things before we go. You're organizing this trip now. You'll be back by the time the governor goes and comes back. Will you do it next year again? Do you expect more people? Will you ever take over? I don't think you've ever taken more than you want to keep it close. I don't think you've ever taken a busful. That's it. And you do that intentionally.
Yes.
Okay, so you're not developing a whole tourist arm to Mickey Meléndez and Cynthia. Okay, you don't do it. You're not in the business of that. You actually want people who can actually have impact on other areas.
And actually, let me just say that it's the cheapest trip organized. If people go online, they see people to people. They see any if it's Smithsonian. Trips are very expensive. So apparently somebody's making money off of this, and people will figure out how to make money.
And it's not you.
That's not our intention. Our intention is to have regular working people. I mean, you were in the room, you saw young people that are just starting their careers, you saw people in their mid-careers, and you saw a bunch of retired people in wheelchairs. Not actually, but so it's intergenerational, the people that we take, and it has to be affordable for them.
I saw your intention I won't get into, but I've got to, before I let you go, at City and State TV, you were telling me of this drawing, this illustration.
It was actually from Cuba.
It was actually. Tell me about that so you can share with them. What happened between Che and Fidel? This conversation that allegedly they had.
Yeah, usually, there's a number of famous pictures when Fidel and Che were together in the mountains, and afterwards also. And there's this picture where their faces are very close to each other. And again, this is a caption that was like in Spanish and came out of Cuba. And Che leans over and he asks Fidel, and he says, "Fidel, do you think?" that the United States will ever have normalization, with the United States? And Fidel looks at him and he says, yeah, when there's a black president and an Argentinian pope like you.
For City and State TV, and if you didn't get that, you're in trouble. For City and State TV with Mickey Meléndez, thanks a lot. Good luck on the trip. Gerson Borrero, and we'll keep talking about Cuba, Cuomo, free trade agreements, and the possibility that opens up with Cuba beginning to show us what it's really like in the Republic in the Caribbean.